Good morning, and welcome back once more to our study through the Gospel of John. We have just emerged from the holiday period, and I hope that you are blessed in your time. Hope that you're able to enjoy some meaningful time with your family and some spiritual time with your family as well. That you might draw closer together as a unit and in your celebration and worship of the presence of God. This gospel, as you know, and as we've emphasized, is one that is intended from its very core to generate faith and belief in who Jesus was and what his mission was when he came to the earth. And so that's why we're taking such a careful time with this, is we want to gain everything we can that can possibly help strengthen our faith in who Jesus was then, but more importantly, who he is to us today and how we relate to him. So I hope that this study is providing you with some clear insight. We are taking our time with it. We have finally gotten through what I call the first cycle of Jesus' ministry here as described in the Gospel of John. This cycle emphasized the power of Jesus to transform things. And we started with Jesus meeting John the Baptist out in the wilderness. There were 4 days described out there, starting with John the Baptist alone. But gradually we saw over those 4 days the focus of the ministry was transformed. Everything shifted from an emphasis on John the Baptist and the old law over to an emphasis on Jesus the Christ and the new law that he would bring into existence. So that was the first example of transformation. Then we saw the wedding feast up in Cana and the miracle of transforming water into wine. And then we saw after that event that Jesus and his disciples and his family went into Capernaum, and that's where they took up their base of operations for their ministry in Galilee, which actually isn't described very much in the Gospel of John. We see much more emphasis on Jesus' Galilean ministry in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But nonetheless, we see these ideas relating to Jesus' power to transform. We saw the ministry focus transformed. We saw the physical miracle transformation when water was changed into wine. But then thirdly, and maybe most importantly, we see the transformation of the lives of those men who were coming to know Jesus and are beginning to learn how to trust him, and eventually would give everything they have for him, including their life. So that is where we end up with cycle 1. Now, cycle 2 starts today. And cycle 2 takes on a little bit of a different focus now. In cycle 2, what we're going to see Jesus relating to different types of people and different groups of people. And so I'm going to call this Jesus going public. Because what we've seen thus far has been relatively private, out in the wilderness, with a group of curious seekers and those who were looking at the law and trying to figure out, does John the Baptist fit in with the law and what we expect, or does Jesus fit in, or do both of them fit in, or neither of them fit in? And so that it was relatively private. Even the miracle that Jesus conducted at Cana was a relatively private event. And we've talked about that in some detail. But now, in cycle 2, we see Jesus absolutely going public. He begins by going to Jerusalem for a Passover. Okay? And so Jerusalem at this point is just filled to the gills with people. And there's crowds everywhere. There's no place to put people. And that's the environment that we pick up with in John chapter 2, starting in verse 13. While Jesus is in Jerusalem, he clears the temple, first of all. Okay? And if he wasn't a public scene before that, now he certainly is. He performs miracles. And then he meets with Nicodemus. Okay, and we'll get into those ideas later as far as their significance and what's going on with them. But I just want you to see the overview right now. So while Jesus is in Jerusalem, he's going to clean up the temple, he's going to perform many miracles, and then he's going to have a meeting with Nicodemus. After he leaves Jerusalem, they go out into the Judean countryside. And then we once again connect with John the Baptist and his ministry. Okay, so while Jesus is doing these things, the Baptist is still doing his piece additionally, okay? And we'll be looking at that. Then Jesus turns back north, goes up through Samaria, okay? And he meets with the woman at the well, and they spend time in Samaria. And then finally, Jesus arrives back in Cana, and there's a healing of an official's son who lives in Capernaum. And then at this point, we have completed cycle 2. So if you take a look at these things on our handy-dandy map, cycle 1 started out here in the wilderness, okay, at the baptismal locations for John the Baptist. And then it moved up to Cana and then over to Capernaum. Now in cycle 2, we're going to start down here in Jerusalem. We're going to go out into the Judean countryside or wilderness, somewhere up in this region most likely, and then transition into Samaria, where he meets the woman at the well, and then back up to Cana. Okay? And so we can see that there's a pattern emerging of Jesus making a trip down to Jerusalem or out into the wilderness or out into Judea and then returning back to Galilee. Okay, so that's what we're going to see in cycle 2. But today we will start by focusing in on this episode of Jesus clearing the temple. I don't think we'll be spending 4 weeks on this. I sort of anticipate maybe a couple of weeks is what this will take. This is found in John chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. And it divides nicely into 3 sections. First of all, we have chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. And this is where actually Jesus does his deed. So this is Jesus' actions. Chapter 2, verses 18 through 22 is the reaction of a group that is now going to start being identified as the Jews. Now this didn't include all of the Jews, but a specific subset of the Jews and how they reacted. And then chapter 2, verses 23 through the end of the chapter, verse 25, we're going to see Jesus performing other miracles and we're going to encounter something that we're going to call miracle faith. Okay? And we'll talk more about that later on. But this is the outline of where we are headed. So today we're going to start here talking about Jesus' actions in verses 13 through verse 17. This, of course, as we mentioned already, is the time of the Jewish Passover. Jerusalem is bursting at the seams. It's filled with religious pilgrims coming from literally all over the nation and all over the world to be in Jerusalem at this time. Indeed, it was one of the 3 annual feasts for which the Jewish men were supposed to go to the temple and make sacrifice. Okay, so all Jewish men were supposed to go there. Excuse me. if you take a look and you remember that in Acts chapter 2, there for the Feast of Pentecost, there were men gathered in Jerusalem from all of the nations. And there's a list there of many nations from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, who had come there. This is the scenario that would have been present in Jerusalem at Passover time. This was the highest feast of Judaism. So it's one that is very, very significant. It's very crowded. And as we said before, even so far in the book of John, we've seen Jesus be relatively private. But now he's going to take the center stage. And it will increasingly, the pressure will come to bear on him. Now, I'm going to read this first, so we'll read verses 13 through 17 here. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" And his disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Okay, so that's the sequence of events that I think you're very familiar with. But there's a problem here when you compare. I don't want to use the word problem. There's a challenge here when you compare what's going on in John's account versus the account of the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the challenge is this. In John, these events are occurring at the first Passover of his ministry. So this is the beginning of his ministry. Okay? But if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these events are occurring at the last Passover of Jesus' ministry. At the end of Jesus. In fact, just a few days before Jesus is crucified. It's immediately after his triumphal entry in the Synoptic Gospels. And so this has led to a challenge, really, in trying to explain this. Did one of these groups get the dates wrong? Or, as unlikely as it sounds, did this happen twice in very similar fashion? Or is it just that, as many have surmised, John doesn't really focus on the timing and the chronology of things? Well, my opinion on this has changed, frankly. I had always sort of thought that John paid less attention to a strict chronology as he recorded these events. But as I've been studying this gospel, John is the most careful of any of the gospel writers to give us chronology and to give us sequence. He's more careful than any of them. He's giving us more ties into the Jewish feast days so that we know when things are occurring. So I no longer think that, and I want to share with you some thinking that, for me, as I've looked at this with, I think, a fresh set of eyes, I believe that this episode in John is different enough from the episodes described in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that I think it's two separate events. Very similar, but nonetheless, it's two separate events. And I would draw your attention to something that just happened in our nation a few days ago. And that is that, there was some horrific activity that took place in our nation's capital. And my question to you is, even though that was such a spectacle over the past 72 hours or so, what do you think Washington's going to look like either 2 or 3 years from now? And I dare say it's going to look very similar to what it did before that event ever occurred. And I suspect that Passover for the Jews was the same thing. What happens here in the Gospel of John is a remarkable event. And what Jesus does, and believe me, I'm not comparing what Jesus did to what occurred in our nation capital. That's not the comparison. The comparison is our tendency to go back to what we view as normal. And I think if Jesus came in at the beginning of his ministry and performed this type of activity, 2 or 3 years later, depending on if there were a total of 3 or 4 Passovers, we don't know the answer to that, and we'll talk about that more later too. But at some point in the future, Jerusalem at Passover is going to look just like it did before Jesus had his first episode. And so I think Jesus is certainly the one to do it again and refresh people's memory of what's important. So I have no problem saying that I believe these events could have occurred more than once. Now, what's the basis for that? And we're going to take a look at some of the differences. What were some of the differences then between what John records and what the synoptic authors record? And again, the synoptic authors are the records of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you want to take this down, I'm not going to write it, but it's in Matthew chapter 21, Mark chapter 11, and Luke chapter 19. Okay, so first, the first difference. What was for sale? In John, we have cattle, we have sheep, and we have doves. In the synoptics, we only see the doves. Okay? In John, we see that Jesus made a whip. The synoptics say nothing about a whip being made. In John, the comments that Jesus makes are, "You have taken my Father's house wait a second. Yes, my Father's house, and you've turned it into a market." In the synoptics, there's a different emphasis. You have taken this house of prayer and turned it into a den of thieves. Now look at those carefully, because these ideas, the cattle, sheep, and the doves, yes, that could be explained, and the fact that the whip doesn't show up, that could just be explained because those are different people telling the story. But look at, there's a significant difference here. In John, Jesus is emphasizing the fact that they are selling animals and changing money in a place that should be dedicated to a different purpose. You've turned my Father's house into a market, an open market. But in the Synoptic Gospels, the focus is on the corruption that's present. That you've turned this house of prayer into a den of thieves so that you're stealing from the people. Okay? And so the emphasis is very different in John's Gospel and what Jesus says in John's Gospel versus what Jesus says in the Synoptics. All right? Take a look at the reaction of the Jews. Okay? In the Gospel of John, the reaction of the Jews, I'll just put reaction, they challenge Jesus. They challenge his authority. But the reaction in the Synoptics, and you can see this especially in Mark 11:18. Let me read that one. Mark 11:18. You'll see the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him. So in John, they challenge him, but here they're plotting to kill. Okay? Again, a significant difference. Jesus makes a statement in John that does not show up in the Synoptics, and he says, "I will tear down this temple and I will rebuild it." That never shows up in the Synoptics. And once again, there's another piece of this that I believe is really, really significant, And this is once again over in Mark. Now, we jump from Mark, what did I say? Mark 11 was where the cleaning of the temple was. No. Yes, Mark 11 was where the temple was cleaned. Now, if you jump over in Mark to chapter 15, which according to Mark is just a few days later, okay, and now the trial is going on, and in chapter 15, listen to these verses from chapter 15 of Mark, starting in verse 55. Well, I am having trouble here because I've gotten some numbers wrong. It's chapter 14, verse 55. I apologize for my confusion here. But this is Jesus being tried before the Sanhedrin, and listen to what they said starting in verse 55. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days we will build another not made by man. Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Now, if this had happened just a few days before, and Mark had just simply omitted it from his retelling of the events in the temple, don't you think that there would have been enough witnesses that heard Jesus say that they could have gotten him to agree? This is just maybe 72 hours after the cleaning of the temple in the Gospel of Mark. And so this is an important difference as well, and I believe one that gives credibility to the idea that there could well have been two separate events. The first one described in the Gospel of John at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The second event told in the Synoptic Gospels that directly related to the plot to kill Jesus and his demise at the end of his ministry. And so that is my response to the thoughts of what was going on and why these events seem different and indeed can be different, but they're very similar. Okay, next, let's talk about the place where this is occurring. This is occurring in the temple courts. And it's interesting, we don't even know exactly how the temple was laid out. If you do a Google search, you'll see different schematics and maps and things of the temple grounds and how it was actually laid out. But we know that the outer courts of the temple consisted of, and I'm trying to figure out, I'm almost out of room here, so I'm not going to write this down. But I guess I am out of room, actually. Actually, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to change pads, and I'm going to just continue on this pad. That'll work. I can write on this. Okay. The place where this occurred was likely the court of the Gentiles, which was the outer court of the temple. If you access the temple grounds, the court of the Gentiles was a place that anybody could get into. It was intended to be a place of prayer. It was intended to be a place of joining together for religious activity and religious ceremony, but you really didn't have direct access to the temple. In order to get direct access, you had to go inside to the inner courts, and the inner courts consisted of a court of women, and that was an area where obviously the women of Israel could attend, but once again, they were still separated from the physical temple itself, and they could not actually see the sacrifices being conducted. The next court was the court of Israel, or the court of the men, and that was a place where it directly surrounded the sacrificial grounds of the temple, where the men could peer through and see the sacrifices being conducted. And then finally you had the court of the priests, which was still outside of the temple, but nonetheless was an area where the priests were exclusively permitted to be. And they actually had signs up in some of these areas warning people not to step over the threshold. And you'll remember that one of the accusations made against the Apostle Paul was that he had invited non-Jewish people into a part of the temple that they were not supposed to be in, and that was part of the accusation that was made against the Apostle Paul. Okay, the other point I want to make about these outer courts where these events occurred, where the selling was going on, where the money changing was going on, the other point I want to make about that is that this is a very significant location because this is also where the Sanhedrin met. The Sanhedrin, of course, was the ruling council of the Jews, and we'll be talking more about that later on, but it is that group who ultimately gives the death sentence with Rome's permission. That they're the ones that ultimately condemn Jesus to death. And they will do it in this very place where Jesus throws out the money changers, throws out those selling animals, and he makes this statement. He says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." And he, of course, is prophesying what they are going to do to him in a matter of either 2 or 3 years, depending on how many years Jesus' ministry lasted. Okay, we'll get into that, though, next week. So I just wanted you to have a little bit of an understanding of the place that this is all occurring and what a significant location it is. Now, what are the temple activities that Jesus is attacking? Well, they really fall into two groups. Number one, it's the process of sacrifice. And number two, it's the payment of the temple tax. Now, obviously, both of these things were commanded in the law. The sacrifices were an ongoing. There were many different types of sacrifices. Some of them were perpetual and continuing on a daily basis. Others were periodic, and especially at these high feast days, there would be a continual sacrificial process going on. The temple tax was a half shekel that was charged, and this was for the maintenance of the temple and the priesthood. It could not be paid with Roman currency, because the Jews felt that the Roman occupation and the Roman money was an abomination to their religious existence. And so they would not allow for the Roman shekel to be used. Therefore, they had to have some mechanism of exchanging money. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. So what I want to emphasize to you is that between these two activities that are taking place, there are all kinds of opportunities for corruption. Okay? The first one we'll talk about is the money changers. The fact that they had to have money changers was an absolute necessity. Listen to some of the different currencies that were in circulation. There were Palestinian copper currency. There was Palestinian silver currency. There was Persian currency. There was Tyrian currency from the country of Tyre, which is just north of Palestine. There was Syrian currency. There was Egyptian currency. There was Grecian currency, and there was Roman currency. We have to recognize, as we mentioned earlier, that these are people coming from all over the known world to convene in Jerusalem for Passover. And so the fact that they had to pay this half shekel of temple tax, they had to have money changers and exchangers. It's just like, going across the border, if they were to say you can't use Canadian currency if in the United States, then everybody would have to exchange and go through an exchange house in order to do trading or do buying of goods. So it set up a situation where there's an opportunity for all kinds of exorbitant rates to be charged, and just flat out, tipping the scales, cheating is what it boils down to. And these money changers had a real opportunity to make a lot of money. Okay? Another opportunity for corruption, selective enforcement. And what I mean by that is that it was routine in the first century for the priests to claim that they did not have to pay the tax. And they could just simply exempt themselves from the payment of the tax. So you can see as we go through these that the temperature of the common people has to be building up because they're seeing this corruption. And just wait, it gets a lot worse. The process of selecting animals, so animal selection process, was another potential for abuse. There actually were men trained in the process of certifying that an animal was okay to use for a sacrifice. And supposedly it took about 18 months of an apprenticeship and a lot of money in order to get this certification. So once you got this certification, you got a title, and you are now known as a mumcha. And what that means is one approved. And you were then the one who could certify that an animal was or was not fit for sacrifice. And obviously there would be all kinds of opportunities here. They would collect their fees for doing this certification for people, but they could also they could force bribes. They could force exorbitant fees. There was opportunity for kickbacks. I mean, they would perhaps fail to certify an animal, send them over to this pen, and then 2 minutes later they would fail to certify that animal, and they'd sell the original animal back to somebody else. So there's all these opportunities for swindling people. And again, as you think about this from the point of view of the common people, they had to be just going crazy by now. But maybe the greatest corruption was there were fees paid to the temple authorities to be able to sell on the temple grounds. Okay? And this was especially promoted by the high priest and his immediate family. The high priest during this period was a man named Annas. And Annas goes down in history as one who was greedy, and he was notorious for this type of abuse. And I'm going to give you a couple of historical references here. First of all, there was a first century rabbinical writing that speaks of the street fairs of the sons of Annas, okay? And that's referring to these temple markets, and it calls them basically, it uses a word like bazaar, not B-I-Z-A-R-R-E, but the word B-A-Z-A-A-R, where you're just selling trinkets and things like that. And that's what they were calling these places that Annas had set up and authorized and approved. By 67 A.D., the popular, the mass of the populace actually revolted against this. And there was an uprising against these bazaars that were taking place by the sons of Annas. And so what was building now at the time of Jesus actually erupts probably 30 years later into an overthrow of this process by the people. So it's not just Jesus now, it's others who have also erupted in this. So I want you to get the picture here that these things that Jesus did, those things would have been welcomed by the common people. Okay? They were sick and tired of this process too. Now, we spoke earlier that Annas' reputation through history was one of greed and abuse. Josephus, the great Jewish historian, characterizes Annas by saying he was a great hoarder of money. And that's the way he characterizes the high priest. What would you think if an elder was characterized as being a hoarder of money? Well, first of all, he shouldn't be an elder because that's clearly spoken against in Timothy and Titus. But just imagine someone who has this type of a spiritual role and such a significant role, and they've been entrusted with that type of responsibility, and instead they're all focused on money. And that's a problem, ladies and gentlemen. The Jewish Talmud records that a distinguished rabbi from Jerusalem placed a curse on the families of the high priest because of their involvement in this type of a racket. And here's what the Talmud says. They were themselves high priests, their sons were the treasurers, their sons-in-law were the assistant treasurers, while their servants beat the people with sticks. And that's the kind of attitude, that fracture that had occurred between the Jewish religious leadership and the people that they were supposed to be serving and facilitating their relationship with God. So this was a very, very volatile situation already that Jesus walked into. Let's not think that Jesus came in here and stirred something up that hadn't already been smoldering. It was already going. And Jesus just picks up the fight. Now, let me ask you this. We just said a few minutes ago, though, I think we said it a few minutes ago. Oh, there it is. It's right top here. We said that the things that were going on there were basically to facilitate the sacrifice process and also the payment of the temple tax. So were these things really that bad? And what is Jesus' criticism about? Well, at this point in John, he doesn't really criticize so much the morality of it and the injustice of it. Instead, Jesus says, you've changed the purpose of this place. This place is supposed to be a house of my Father, and you have turned it into a street market. Okay? So his criticism, even though all these excesses exist, his criticism is really directed at not following through with the purpose of the temple, and that it is his Father's house. Recall that when Jesus was at 12 years old, do you remember what he said when his parents inquired why he had stayed behind in Jerusalem? You remember he said, "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" And now that language shows up again when he says, "You are turning my Father's house into a market." And so Jesus is now claiming his rightful place as the Son of the Father. Jesus is saying, this is my Father's house. I am in charge here. And you are not. Okay, take a look. I want you to look at Malachi chapter 3, because this is a direct, we don't usually see prophecy fulfilled as directly as this is, but watch what Malachi said in chapter 3, starting in verse 1. "See, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me." Okay, that of course was John the Baptist who had come. "Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. And then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings in righteousness. And the offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be acceptable to the Lord, as in days gone by, as in the former years." Do you see that Malachi said, the Lord that you are seeking will come to his temple, and when he does, there will be a refining and a purification that takes place. Now, this is fulfilled, verbatim here in John chapter 2. And what we see Jesus doing, this is not the final fulfillment of that prophecy, but this is a fulfillment of that prophecy. And Jesus is indeed refining and purifying his Father's house. And that is what's going on here. What was the root problem of what was going on in the temple? How do you get to a place where you've lost that much focus and things that are not important have become tremendously important to you, and the place has lost its sacredness? It has lost its reason for existence. How does it get to that point? Well, I think in the case of Israel, what we can identify is that the law, and John the writer is going to expound on this as we move forward through the book. He's going to identify that the law for many had become just a bunch of outward activity and a bunch of outward actions. And so we've got to get these sacrifices done. Here's some things that we can do to make the process easier. We just got to focus on get the sacrifices done. That's the important thing. And it's going to cost us some money, or we can make some money off of this. And gradually, as you start down that path, there's going to be all kinds of corruption that enters in. But the place that you leave it is the place you leave the path is when you begin to focus only on what I am doing and how that pleases God. Hosea 6 verse 6 says this: I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And I desire the acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. The law was filled with commandments to sacrifice and to give burnt offerings. But that wasn't the main thing. It never was. The main thing was developing a heart of mercy and an understanding of God. That's what Hosea says. Jesus quotes those same words in Matthew 9 and in Matthew 12 as he is confronting the people with their excesses and with the corruption that has evolved and taken place. But it begins in that place where sacrifice becomes the important function just simply because it's something that I have to do, and it becomes part of a checklist. And that's where I want for us to challenge ourselves. Because, no, we may not be at an excess where we are dealing with this type of corruption. But have we not seen that Christianity can easily be reduced to a bunch of boxes that we check off based on what we've done? Church attendance, check. Contribution, check. How much? Salvation is a series of 5 concrete steps. I just do those things and I've got my ticket punched. Check. I'm involved in ministry. I go help at the soup kitchens. I help teach in Bible classes. Check. But isn't there something about the motives, the attitudes that we bring to those activities that's so much more important? Remember, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I desire your heart, not your external actions. So don't remove the focus from God and put it on our own activity. We can see that when it occurs. Think about a worship service. Think about how easy it is to tell whether there is really a legitimate focus. How much preparation is put into the service, not just by those who are participating in it up front, but how much preparation goes in when you think about, am I getting adequate sleep on Saturday night before we meet together? Am I showing up in time, or am I just rushing in to get to my seat? Where's our emphasis? Don't you think those are sort of saying, I just need to check the box? No, that's not what God expects. God wants our hearts, not just our external actions. So we can see when we're starting to lose focus, the timeliness of our gatherings, the preparation for the gatherings, the prioritization, the things that we will put in place of a service to God, how casual our services can sometimes seem, What about our intensity of worship? How much background noise is there? Sometimes you almost think you're going to hear snoring. You know, that's not a measure of intensity in that scenario. Instead, are we there seeing the God of our salvation for who He is and what He has given up to make my life meaningful? And that's the question that has to be behind us. As we watch Jesus here clean house, let's not fall into that same trap, that same pattern. And I'm convinced that what is needed above all else is just a continual awareness of the presence of God in my life, every moment of every day. And I'm not saying that I have solved that for me, but it's something that I'm working towards. And I hope you are too. Okay, let's celebrate being together in Christ. I look forward to the day when we can easily all reassemble. But until then, don't forget, God is good all the time.